It's a great honor and a great pleasure to be before you this afternoon as we present the 2015 Bill and Roberta Bailey Family Lecture in Christian Ethics, sponsored by the Institute for Faith and Learning. I'm Darren Davis. I'm the director of the Institute. I'm also greatly honored to be a faculty member at George W. Truett Theological Seminary. I really want to express my appreciation to my colleagues in the seminary and students here for allowing us Paul Powell Chapel here at Truett Seminary as a place in which we can gather for this wonderful lecture. The Institute for Faith and Learning could not exist without strong support from the administration of Baylor University. And for the last 5 years, we have had the steadfast encouragement, both in word and deed, of our President and Chancellor, Judge Ken Starr, who is so kind to join us this afternoon and would like to offer a word of welcome. But would you just join me in thanking Judge Starr for his support of efforts like this and his stewardship of Baylor University.
Well, thank you for being here. Candace, thank you for coming all the way from that great Baptist university, the University of Chicago. David Brooks of the New York Times said, the University of Chicago, where he did his undergraduate work, the University of Chicago, a Baptist university where atheist professors teach Thomas Aquinas to Jewish students. Think of it. The Bailey family. I'm sorry that Bill could not be here on the eve, I believe, of Bill's, your dear father's, 86th birthday. If it were appropriate in this chapel, we would sing happy birthday and make sure that Bill was listening. But just let your dear father know, who is so dear to Baylor University, that in spirit we sing happy birthday to him. Wes, thank you for your ongoing service, including as a member of the Board of Regents, for your generosity of spirit. Roy, even though you're a Mustang, we claim you. We love you as a brother, even though you went astray. But you've come home, and all that you continue to do for higher education, including Southern Methodist University, thank you. And then Hatch, thank you for being here. To the entire Bailey family extended. And so let me close this already overlong word of thanks and welcome by saying, Darren, we love you, and we're so thankful for all that you do in both your capacities. So please join me again in saying thank you to Professor Darren Davis.
Bailey family, you are very dear to this institution, and you're very dear to your friends and your family here in Waco, and very dear to those who you serve alongside in so many charitable capacities, and you're also dear to the Davis family. And so thank you for your friendship and the honor of this. It's my great honor to introduce today's lecturer, who will bring the 2015 Bailey Family Lecture in Christian Ethics, Professor Candace Vogler of the University of Chicago. Professor Vogler is the David B. and Clara E. Stern Professor of Philosophy at the University of Chicago, where she has taught since 1992. She has served in other capacities at Chicago, including as co-director of the Master of Arts program in the Humanities from 2000 to 2007, and also a 3-year stint as chair of the philosophy department at the University of Chicago from 2011 to 2014. She has received a number of fellowships and awards at institutions both here and abroad, including at her home institution, the Niebuhr Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching. She is the author and editor of 4 books, including Reasonably Vicious, Harvard University Press, 2002. She is working on a book on Elizabeth Anscombe, who was an enormously important figure in the contemporary revival of virtue ethics. There was an essay written by Anscombe in 1958 titled Modern Moral Philosophy, which signaled a sea change in the way in which academic philosophers thought about the notion of virtue and the way in which we can talk about the virtues of character and the formation into them and their importance in a flourishing life. Professor Vogler is also a great friend of Baylor University. Having been a speaker at our annual retreat held at Lady Lodge for the last 2 years, she has friends here who have been the recipient of her wisdom about education, the direction of higher education, and been able to learn so much from her as a really acclaimed teacher at the University of Chicago. For all of that, for all of her accomplishments, Candace Vogler is just a terrific human being and a wonderful friend. And I can think of no better person to offer this year's lecture on moral courage than my good friend Candace Vogler. Please join me in welcoming her.
Darren, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Darren's a very good friend, and I am a deep supporter of Baylor University and extremely honored to be invited to give you this lecture on Christian moral courage. Now, I should say at the outset that I work on virtue. I'm a virtue theorist at heart, in spite of the title of that book. And I don't believe that there's any such thing as immoral courage, actually. So it could just have been called Christian courage, and that would have carried the weight. But here we go. Okay, one of the striking features of Christianity is the sheer number of times that the New Testament warns us that we may be reviled, hated, betrayed, persecuted, or murdered because we are Christians. Now, there are reasons that the Greek term martys, to witness, came to signify Christians who face torture and death rather than renounce their faith. Martyr means to witness. Okay. In this sense, historically, being called to Christ has meant being prepared to suffer for one's faith when that was needed. It still does in a lot of parts of the world. There are still a lot of Christians who undergo persecution in his name's sake. I don't think Waco's one of them, so we're probably okay this afternoon. Okay. But the suffering was not supposed to be foolish suffering, and the kind of courage Christians were meant to develop was inflected by faith, hope, and God's love for us. We could rightly hope for divine assistance when facing very serious trials. In this sense, we can be available to something that goes beyond the ordinary virtue of courage when put to the test. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ordinary virtues, drawing heavily on Aquinas' work on this topic. I'm actually a Christian who teaches about Aquinas to a lot of different people. Then I'll talk a bit about specifically Christian courage. It is my great hope that none of us will face the kinds of trials endured by Christian martyrs. What we will face, I think, is a different sort of challenge, a sort that the world handles in one way, and that our faith should allow us to handle in a very different way. It is a challenge that arises at the intersection of justice and faith, not unrelated to the challenge of being steadfast in one's faith in the face of actual or threatened persecution. And I'm going to start with the fall. As a starting point, consider the phrase darkened intellect, disturbed passions, and disordered will as a description of how things are for human beings generally. Now, for some, the phrase has theological significance and points to the fall from grace. For others who occasionally read the newspaper, watch television, or lament things that family members, friends, neighbors, civic leaders, or other people do, the phrase may be no more than a concise description of our lot. It is often hard for us to direct our energies toward long-term, lasting good, when doing so would prevent us from pursuing more immediate gains, or toward the common good, when that looks to be at odds with private advantage. This is a way of summarizing the trouble, not just when we lie, cheat, steal, or commit acts like murder, rape, fraud, or torture on however big or small a scale, but also in the thousand small occasions when we are impatient, selfish, moody, dishonest, ungenerous, or foolish. What interests me about these things is not the breathtaking commonality of bad judgment, bad responses, bad habits, and bad deeds. It is rather the extraordinary fact that perfectly ordinary people know better. We may not put this knowledge to good use. We may not seek to improve our own characters and actions, but we know better. And because we know better, we also know to be struck by our fellows' patience, kindness, justice, honesty, and courage. Given that one can notice the descriptive accuracy of the phrase darkened intellect, disturbed passions, and disordered will without adverting to revealed knowledge about God's acts, the fact that we know better should be striking. The only way to make sense of this is to suppose that we are not utterly benighted. Some spark, some bright corner carries an understanding of the way in which we are, frankly, a mess, by carrying some sense of what things might be if we were well ordered. Assuming, as seems plausible, that none of us has much experience with an entirely well-governed, perfect human being, we should be at least as struck by the fact that we know better as we are by the fact that we frequently fall short. For Aquinas, cultivation of virtue helps to remedy this situation. Even though very few of us will develop entirely harmonious, reasonable, practical orientations directed at good, with or without discipline and training, Aquinas, like Aristotle, takes it that we are nevertheless drawn that way. Fundamentally, we seek to pursue good and avoid evil, which is why we have it in us to work to improve ourselves in the first place. For Aquinas, human nature as we know it is fallen nature. We are, he thinks, operating at a loss. Aquinas thought that original sin deprived humankind of something called original justice. Now, how did things stand for us before the fall, according to Aquinas? Eileen Sweeney puts the point this way, quote, "What is strange about Aquinas' view is that a purely natural state of humankind has, strictly speaking, never existed. Before the fall, nature had a kind of supernatural strength, and after that, nature is somewhat, although not radically, depleted," close quote. The supernatural strength in original justice was a matter of orientation and governance. The human's higher powers were subject to God, the lower powers to the higher powers, and the body to the soul. Aquinas adds a fourth subjection in his commentary on Romans. Before the fall, exterior things were subject to humankind, such that they served the human, and the human was not harmed by them. I love this one. It's like Adam couldn't have stubbed his toe. In the prelapsarian condition, perfect rectitude of the will was possible. In the prelapsarian condition, humans could act on their innate love of God without impeding themselves. This is the sense in which the gift of original justice perfects human nature. It places our powers in proper order, given the kinds of creatures we are. Where do we land after the fall, according to Aquinas? My interpretation is fairly simple. What's lost is original justice. Original justice is an ordering of mentality and will that allows us to direct ourselves to God appropriately. The darkening of the intellect consists in our finding ourselves in a situation where the intellect is no longer directed to God and the lower powers no longer subject to reason. Just as the first is the most important in original justice, its loss is the most important loss incurred through original sin. Rational appetite no longer effectively operates in and from practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is no longer appropriately governed by God. Although it is most common when writing about this in Aquinas to emphasize the ramifications of loss of original justice in terms of the loss of the downward subjections, intellect to God, lower powers to higher powers, body to soul, one could just as easily emphasize the upward inclination toward God that is impeded by the loss of original justice. Impediment is not the same as obliteration. The corrective supplied by virtues like temperance, courage, justice, and practical wisdom is meant to address the loss of the kind of governance proper to our natures given the kinds of creatures that we are, to begin to reintegrate our powers, or at least foster cooperation among them in a way that helps to rectify the will. In effect, for our kind of intellect, the sort an animal can embody, and our kind of animal, the sort endowed with intellect as such, oriented to the highest good possible for us, the darkening of the intellect is the loss of order in inclination and governance that helps us to direct ourselves to the goods it belongs to us to pursue. For Aquinas, a virtue is a strength that helps order you appropriately. That's how you tell the difference between a virtue and, say, a vice. Okay, now, there are two sorts of tasks for Aquinas, Aquinas' treatment of virtue. One concerns our relations with one another and to the common good. The other concerns our return home to God. The second is the subject of infused virtues, virtues that we get from God. The first is the subject of acquired virtues, the ones that we get through ordinary habituation. These two do not operate separately, entirely separately for Aquinas. The work happens together. Okay. Aquinas thinks that he takes from Aristotle an account of 4 acquired virtues that are principal acquired virtues: practical wisdom. His name for it is prudentia, but the word prudence in English means sort of timid, calculating caution, wise investment or something. Practical wisdom is what he means, and so practical wisdom is better, I think. Justice, courage, and temperance. Aquinas spells out in some detail why these are cardinal virtues and how we need all of them to act well without impeding ourselves. Following Aristotle broadly, he takes it that a virtue brings the full and appropriate actualization of a human power, one that allows for both the upward inclination of passions and appetite toward reason and God, and the downward governance of passion and appetite by reason, actualized in an overall pursuit of the good. Michael Pakaluk, a Thomist scholar, puts the point this way: a virtue, quote, a virtue is a trait that makes someone such that his activity, what he does, what he's responsible for, is reasonable. But there are 4 basic types of such activity: his thinking itself as practical and directed at action, his actions, ordinarily so called, and how he is affected. This last category splits into 2, Aquinas thinks, on the grounds that acting reasonably in the realm of the passions involves regulating both the passions by which we are drawn to something, temperance, and the passions by which we are repulsed from something, courage. These 2 sorts of passions imply 2 sorts of tasks or achievements, which the ordinary distinction between the virtues of temperance and courage confirms, close quote. Aquinas' account of virtue relies heavily on these points based in his reading of Aristotle. Aristotle's work is broadly consistent with treating practical wisdom as the virtue responsible for sound practical thinking and judgment. It's a virtue of the intellect directed to the will. Justice, for Aquinas, a virtue of the will directed at extramental activities, primarily those that concern giving each his due. Jean Porter underscores this point and urges taking justice in its full generality seriously. Quote, as a virtue of the will, justice is the only cardinal virtue which directly concerns the distinctively human capacity for rational desire. Moreover, it is the cardinal virtue directly concerned with external actions, and as such, it includes most of the norms of non-maleficence and respect for others. Close quote. As Pakaluk noted, temperance and courage are virtues of the passion. Passion's temperance renders attractions to desirable things reasonable, and courage is charged with reasonable aversion, principally with controlling our fear so that we can be appropriately steadfast. Crudely, then, practical wisdom corrects for darkened intellect, temperance and courage for disturbed passions, and justice for a disordered will. Aquinas thinks that he's taking from Aristotle an understanding of these four cardinal virtues as such that as working together in a way that requires us to cultivate all of them in order to lead a good human life. These work in tandem. Okay, and each of these ordinary virtues is directed toward what Aquinas calls the common good. There are very few models of the kind of common good at issue in acquired virtue for Aquinas out there. The common good does not just go beyond a measure of individual welfare. It doesn't just go beyond the measure of aggregated individual welfare. The common good has to do with the overall cross-generational good of a community, and that community can be very extensive. I will give you an example of common good in thinking about gratitude. There has been a lot of research on gratitude as a virtue in recent years. It's interesting, in the United Kingdom, they're very interested in doing research on humility and gratitude as virtues. In the United States, the new hot virtues are resilience and grit. It's kind of, there's like cowboy virtues over here. These are all going to be treated by Aquinas as what he calls secondary virtues. Secondary doesn't mean less, any more than like secondary school is less than primary school, right? It's where you can take the strength that you already have and develop it further. It strengthens and develops further, okay? But I want to think about gratitude. Now, the model of gratitude that shapes an awful lot of contemporary research is essentially what they call triadic. Triadic means this. Say, Darren over there does me some very specific good. He's my benefactor. I'm his beneficiary. There's a benefit passed from him to me. That means I'm supposed to be proportionately grateful to Darren for just this little packet of good that's come my way. Okay? Contrast this with the kind of gratitude at issue in what gets called giving back. Okay. Giving back is a very different understanding of gratitude than this triadic one. When you give back, you do a good or a benefit that plants a seed of good that's going to amplify in ways that you can't foresee or envision. Far from it being the case that I even know the names of all the individual people whose struggles and history have been provided a basis for me to be where I am and enjoy the goods I enjoy. They won't know me, they won't know what I'm gaining from them. Their good made possible an awful lot of good for me. So when I'm called upon to give back, I'm called upon to honor the human history and the human good that's moving forward in my life, and to try to continue that by planting seeds that will be of benefits that I can't possibly foresee in the future. Good gets amplified through human activity. Okay? And it's the same notion whether you're talking about the way in which the little kids in my community, I live on the south side of Chicago, talk about giving back. The kids who live on my alley, who are mostly not very wealthy African American children, and they're called to give back a lot. Or any of us giving back. I mean, it's the same notion, I think. The sense of, this notion of giving back operates with an implicit sense that good is supposed to come of good, and that this good that could come of good could be incalculably greater than any good you can sense or see when you're trying to pursue some good or ward off some bad thing here and now. You could think of this as the It's a Wonderful Life principle. George Bailey endures an awful lot and turns his back on an awful lot of potential opportunities because there's some immediate moral need that he faces. When the angel shows him what Bedford Falls would have been, had he not done that, he realizes that the little things that he was doing all along contributed to a world that was vastly better than anything he would have expected. Okay, in this instance, right, the acquired virtue that serves the common good of the earthly community begins to open onto Christian virtue, which orients us to a transcendent good. Remember when I mentioned that watching the news is usually enough to suggest that human affairs are in a mess and a muddle? Now, why on earth would you think that good should come of good? Do we just have some funny, sweet, sort of sentimental attachment to the idea that good ought to be amplified by still more good? I mean, is it just that, that's a nicer way, it's a nicer outlook to have? I don't think so. Actually, I think that this sort of orientation to the future is built into human reason in a perfectly general way, but that Christian faith gives us actual grounds for the orientation. In effect, because we understand that we have a just and perfectly loving Creator, we can know that any badness that comes of genuinely good acts is an accident. We don't do good expecting bad, even if we can foresee some bad coming of good. By exactly the same token, any good that comes of a bad act is an accident. We can't do wicked deeds and expect good to come of them. How does our understanding of our Creator give us grounds for this conviction? Well, for starters, we know that the wages of sin is death. That's about what you need here. In short, we know that evil is supposed to come of evil. We can spot these things. In short, we know, more specifically, we know that some kinds of acts are, by their very nature, evil. We can spot these things, in part through the amount of human attention and effort that's given over to figuring out which acts are instances of these kinds. Think, for example, of the amount of attention that has been paid to determining what acts will count as instances of rape or of murder or of genocide. With these kinds of acts, there can be no question of doing the thing at the right time or in the right sort of way or in the right manner to make it okay. These are acts that are never to be done. An alternative way of expressing what I take to be exactly the same point is that any good that comes of such an act is entirely accidental. It is not in the nature of such acts to produce or amplify anything good. That we are in any position to expect amplified good to come of the good that we try to do is, I think, a quiet whisper of grace in our very ordinary way of reckoning what will happen if we act well. The whisper is always there to be heard, even though we may only feel the force of its voice when we think about things that should not happen and should never have happened to people struggling to lead upright and good lives in the face of every worldly pressure to do otherwise. This is, I take it, the basis for Christian moral courage, the thing that we can hold on to when our faith is tested in ways large and small. Aquinas thought that grace supplies more than just this for us when our faith is severely tested. He thought that however well or badly we had done cultivating a virtuous character, grace could bring us special strengths, and the Holy Spirit could provide special gifts that turned our everyday orientation to do good and avoid evil toward salvation and union with God. This is the point of all of the theological virtues in Aquinas: faith, hope, and charity, caritas, love, in this very special sense where I'm trying to make myself a vessel through which God's love can move out, and I can join with the rest of you in love. Craig Stephen Titus puts the point this way, quote, God directs us to our supernatural end through divinely bestowed theological virtues. Because of charity's place therein, charity is this caritas virtue, infused fortitude goes beyond the range of its acquired counterpart, in which human beings in our capacity as citizens order our actions to the common good. Charity commands infused fortitude and martyrdom, ordering it to the ultimate end, the vision of God. Infused fortitude's very acts are formally acts of charity, since it takes its species formally from charity. However, it is not due only to infused fortitude being formally an act of charity that infused and acquired fortitude differ. Rather, they specifically differ because infused fortitude's acts establish a mean ordered to the ultimate end, that is, the object of charity, while acquired fortitude is ordered just to the common good. Infused fortitude, the kind that where God is strengthening our courage, is directed to our union with God, and it's an expression of God's love. Okay, the goodness of God is both our source and our destination. We need God's grace to make it home to Him, but it's central to a Christian understanding of human life that the very possibility of salvation is there for us through Christ. And Aquinas is not alone in thinking that grace will help us find the strength we need, supplementing our ordinary decency with special strengths when we need these. One of the places we need God's help is with standing firm when faced with arguments that we have to do or support evil acts or policies for the sake of averting catastrophes or making some great good possible. You've probably heard these arguments. I'm assuming you've heard these arguments. Philosophers, people in my line of work, they love inventing cases like this. If you murder this one, you will prevent the murder of those 6. Philosophers love these things. I don't, but they do. Sorry. But these cases have become the mainstay of a particular brand of what I think of as sort of liberal common sense. The world thinks that it's obvious that you should murder or rape or try to break someone in order to avert a catastrophe. If Christians complain, they think that we're either afraid of going to hell. Now, of course, it's not wrong to fear going to hell. Nobody should think, oh, that would be fine, right? It's not wrong. Or that we think that God has somehow rearranged everything so that the costs and benefits will add up differently in the long haul, given that you've got a sufficiently long scope here. Again, it's not that it's wrong to suppose that the creation is an orderly creation and that God is just. That's not wrong. But they treat this as a matter of weighing and measuring, a kind of cost-benefit situation. Okay. So, I think that we are certainly right to think that no lasting and amplifying good is going to come from a wicked act or a bad policy, right? But the whole business of trying to understand this Christian conviction on the basis of this funny sort of calculation interprets our willingness to stand firm in the face of arguments that we ought to do or support wicked acts or policies so that more good will come of it. It misinterprets, it gets it completely backward, why we think that. The point is rather that any good that comes of such things is going to be an accident, not something that you should count on. And that this is something we know by both reason and grace. The good we do and seek, however, tends not accidentally to blossom into bringing more good. So this one very special little ordinary day-to-day sphere for a kind of Christian moral courage comes from standing up against evil, refusing to support evil acts and evil policies, even if people tell us that by supporting these things, we will somehow avert a catastrophe or make a very great good possible. For me, at least, this is part of the lesson from Daniel Book 5, the Mene Mene Tekel Paris lesson, that the weighing and measuring approach to trying to calculate on a good coming from an increased stream of evil is wrong. And it's wrong because it's the wrong sort of relation we have to the moral order where we find ourselves, and it's wrong because we fail in our attempt to have the right sort of relation to God when we do it. Thank you.
From the philosophy department here at Baylor. When you were distinguishing the sort of Christian moral courage from regular moral courage, you noted the way in which regular moral courage, as it were, aims to become good, and Christian moral courage aims at union with God or supernatural good. And I was just curious if you could elaborate a bit at how you see those ever coming apart. I took it by the way you described the situation that there would be a substantial difference. So could you just elaborate for us?
Well, I mean, properly speaking, they shouldn't come apart. Okay. At least not for somebody who is as interested in Aquinas as I am and is influenced by him. They don't really come apart. But the traditional understanding of the acquired virtue of courage has it that it shows itself, for instance, in the battlefield. That there's an aggressive aspect to courage that's in some ways the central feature of it. In a traditional Aristotelian picture, it's like that. It's not that the Thomist picture doesn't believe that, but for the Thomist, even acquired courage, acquired Christian courage, developed Christian courage, is as often a matter of endurance as it is a matter of aggression. And being willing to suffer or endure is the more usual route for Christian courage to show itself. Things that are very, very difficult, sometimes even the threat of death, right? That kind of thing. So it's the way in practice, I don't think they can actually come apart because they're directed at the highest good possible, both of them. The earthly virtue tends to show itself more, the ordinary acquired Aristotelian type virtue is going to show itself more in places where I stand up for something for the sake of my immediate community and its common good. The infused virtue will be a place where my faith is directly tested. So I'm standing up for my faith in the face of worldly pressure to do otherwise. Does that help?
Thank you very much. I'm Scott Moore from the Great Text Program at the Philosophy Department. So following up on this line, that in the Aristotelian picture, where courage is characterized by aggression and exemplified by the soldier, and then for Thomas, where caritas is at the center, it now becomes that courage is characterized by endurance and exemplified by the martyr. When we transform that and we begin to think about our lives, we are often in the situation of having to endure or accept some great moral evil. Aristotle gives us a provision for choosing the lesser of the evils in an attempt to find the mean along the lines. When we Christians are faced with a choice among evils, whether to endure an evil or to commit an evil in the hopes of doing good, how do we guide action in this moment, enduring this difficulty?
I think we don't commit an evil. I know that people talk about greater and lesser evils. And of course, there are greater and lesser evils. That's, of course, the case. But we ought not, I think, it's never a show of Christian courage to commit an especially grave evil, to do something like commit a morally prohibited act, a murder, a rape, to participate in a genocide, something like this. In this special category of morally prohibited acts, we just don't do them. We just don't do them. Now, philosophers love to invent cases where it's a choice between, committing an evil or, enduring an evil or something. But I think that Christian faith equips us to at least have the strength to stand with morality, with justice, with God, in the face of pretty severe temptation to do otherwise. And that's the place where we need, I think, grace to help us get through. But I'm not sure, I'm afraid I maybe didn't understand exactly your question, so, okay. The thing you do with morally prohibited act types is just you don't do them, period. That's how you avoid them, is by not doing those things.
So I'm wondering, what do you say? What kind of courage is it? Infused or natural courage? If somebody endures evil for the sake of a religious belief that is false, say, is willing to die rather than profess the Trinity because in good conscience they believe that God is not a Trinity.
These are really complicated cases, a lot of these. Aquinas has arguments that you're kind of stuck in this situation because you're not supposed to act against your conscience, but even an erring conscience binds. But you are supposed to use everything at your disposal to ensure that your conscience is appropriately directed and informed. So a mystery like the Trinity, that's very difficult. And of course, it's occasioned huge controversies, right? But the central aspect, and of course, most of my Catholic friends would say that it's not Christian faith if it's not Trinitarian faith and all that kind of stuff. But something about, at the very least, the understanding of the Son, the Christ, as having been sacrificed for the sake of our salvation, as having taken sin upon himself through the incarnate suffering for the sake of our salvation and his resurrection. Without that, you don't have much of anything. So these finer points about, are there two distinct personalities? Are there two distinct substances? Are there two distinct natures? The funny metaphysical concerns that people have had over the Trinity, I don't know. It's a complicated situation. You're supposed to act from conscience. Erring conscience binds, even though it's erring. There are, however, you're not, however, doing the right sort of thing or exhibiting Christian moral courage if you're just throwing yourself on the flames, racing forward to be sacrificed, that sort of thing. You're supposed to do caution. You're not supposed to be in a hurry to be martyred. That's not a Christian stance. This life is a gift.
ask a question? Maybe reflect a bit about the question of formation in Christian moral courage. I think about that a lot with respect to congregational life and the way in which churches should help form those who worship into courage. I think about it a lot in terms of the kind of upbringing that we want our daughters and our sons to have. But we miss the mark when we talk about courage in these sort of great, extraordinary cases where we're standing against religious persecution, or Abazar exemplar, David and Goliath. And it seems to me courage might be a little bit more present in every day a virtue than we might imagine it is. So we should just reflect on how we become formed in this on the acquired side of virtue.
Courage is the ability to be steadfast when you ought to be steadfast, and to flee when you ought to flee. Right? It's not courage as you stand firm no matter what's going on. Sometimes the thing you ought to do, the thing that is actually the wise and virtuous thing to do, is to get out of someplace, get away from it. In everyday sorts of affairs, just things like speaking truthfully about your faith when asked about it, with people who are outside, those kinds of things, and actually modeling this for young people around and helping support them in this, I think can be huge. I mean, I teach at a university that once had a Baptist mission and no longer does, something like just being there to support Christian students in that kind of a setting, I think is a certain sort of a work that I'm doing, trying to form them, help them form in Christian courage. In fact, the original source of the reflections in this talk was a kind of thing that I have had to say to a bunch of my Christian students who were just horrified at what their non-Christian students seemed willing to do if they were told that you have to do this thing or some really terrible thing will happen. And I said, you have to realize that you have a secret advantage that your fellow students don't have. Your faith gives you the basis to know that you cannot calculate on having good come of a wicked deed. That's not an appropriate way to measure your behavior or do your behavior. So part there is, in that instance, it's helping them have ways of responding to their fellow students. I mean, that you can hold that any good that comes of a wicked deed is only an accident on the basis of, like, Kant. You don't even need Christianity. You can get there on other routes. That's part of why I think it's part of the basic equipment of reason. But in Christian faith, we have a special charge to stand for justice, morality, Christ, and so on in a perfectly ordinary, everyday way. Is that at all?
Yes, thank you for your talk. I'm very heartened at teach theology. If I read Aristotle and Aquinas rightly, I could well have not, they do not allow for the kind of tragic conflict that one finds, for example, in Sophocles, in which the conflict is not between two evils, but between two competing and legitimate goods. So I'm thinking here of those few brave souls, courageous souls in Nazi Germany who conspired against Hitler, and they were torn by this, particularly in terms of tyrannicide. And so I'm just wondering, in your presentation of this particular virtue, but as a moral life more generally, how would you have counseled those poor souls in this regard? Because there's legitimate good in bringing the Nazi regime to an end. But there's also the command of God, do not kill, do not murder.
Do not murder, yeah. And the plots to assassinate Hitler were definitely murder plots. These weren't, let's hope he has an accident ideas. Well, there's complicated questions about what counts as a military act and what counts as something other than a military act, what counts as a military action against a regime, and what counts as something else at issue here. I guess I would wish it could be the case that tyrants could be apprehended and brought to justice rather than just mowed down. I would hope that that would be the case. There may be circumstances where that's just, it's very hard to see how that could ever come about. And it might very well be that Nazi Germany is such an instance and Hitler is such an instance. But I guess I sort of feel like we don't take it in our hands to murder somebody and expect that good will follow. I mean, it's the collapse of the Nazi regime would, of course, be a great good, but it's not like there weren't cracks in its architecture already at the point that people were plotting assassination of Hitler. It was already cracking at that point. So I'm not sure how exactly I would have counseled them, but organizing resistance would have been more my style than, murder.
Because the classical account of courage has strong associations with warfare, coupled with male privilege, how does a Christian account of courage reconfigure, demythologize the doctrine of masculinity, which often funds and habituates courage today?
Thank you, that's a wonderful question. Of course, the central exemplar of Christian courage would be Christ, it's the opposite of machismo, the kind of endurance that Christ showed, the kind of forbearance that Christ showed, the kind of steadfastness that Christ showed. Those are our models for Christian courage, the kind of humility, and most importantly, the kind of love, right, guiding it all, that Christ showed, are our model for Christian courage. We started with a murder, sort of, and I take it that those are pretty diametrically opposed to sort of Homeric heroic virtue or even Aristotelian battlefield for the sake of the polis courage. Although, of course, it could be the case that Christian courage sometimes shows itself in an aggressive mood. I mean, Christ was not, shy about the money changers in the temple. He was not like, no. I mean, when the occasion is right for it, then you move aggressively for the sake of the faith. But you do that ideally with a great deal of hope and guidance and faith and support from a congregation and prayer and so forth. You don't usually spontaneously take it upon yourself to do such a thing without very solid grounding. Does that help?
Please join me again in thanking Candace Vogler.